Part 4. The World of the Simple. Introduction. What is it that is especially interesting in the simple? It has to do with qualities of mind which are preserved, even enhanced, so that, though mentally defective in some ways, they may be mentally interesting, even mentally complete, in others. Qualities of mind other than the conceptual. As Clifford Geertz repeatedly emphasizes, savages are neither simple nor children, children have no savage culture, and the simple are neither savages nor children. If we are to use a single word here, it would have to be concreteness. Their world is vivid, intense, detailed, yet simple, precisely because it is concrete, neither complicated, diluted, nor unified by abstraction. The concrete is elemental. It is what makes reality real, alive, personal, and meaningful. All of this is lost if the concrete is lost. The idea of the preservation of the concrete in brain damage, not regression to it, but preservation of it, so that the essential personality and identity and humanity, the being of the hurt creature, is preserved. With all the moral weight and rich imagination of a man, despite the devastation of his abstract and propositional powers. Classical science has no use for the concrete. It is equated with the trivial in neurology and psychiatry. It needs a romantic science to pay it its full due, and in the simple we are confronted with the concrete head-on, the concrete pure and simple, in unreserved intensity. It can constitute the portal to sensibility, imagination, depth. Or it can confine the possessor, or the possessed, to meaningless particulars. But of much greater interest, much more human, is the proper use and development of the concrete. The concrete may become a vehicle of mystery, beauty, and depth, a path into the emotions, the imagination, the spirit fully as much as any abstract conception. Conceptually, then, mental defectives may be cripples, but in their powers of concrete and symbolic apprehension they may be fully the equal of any normal individual. Kierkegaard wrote on his deathbed, "A man may be very low intellectually, unable to put a key to a door, much less understand the Newtonian laws of motion, wholly unable to comprehend the world as concepts, and yet fully able, and indeed gifted, in understanding the world as concreteness, as symbols." This is the other side, the almost sublime other side, of the singular creatures, the gifted simpletons, Martin, Jose, and the twins. 21. Rebecca. Rebecca was 19, but, as her grandmother said, she could not find her way around the block. She could not confidently open a door with a key she had left/right confusion. She seemed to have no sense of space. Although when she danced, all her clumsiness disappeared. Rebecca had a partial cleft palate, which caused a whistling in her speech, short, stumpy fingers, with blunt, deformed nails, and a high, degenerative myopia requiring very thick spectacles, all stigmata of the same congenital condition which had caused her cerebral and mental defects. She was painfully shy and withdrawn. But she was capable of warm, deep, even passionate attachments. Her grandmother had brought her up since she was 3, when she was orphaned by the death of both parents. She was very fond of nature. She has a hunger for stories, her grandmother said. She needed the world represented to her in verbal images, in language, and seemed to have little difficulty following the metaphors and symbols of even quite deep poems, in striking contrast to her incapacity with simple propositions and instructions. She could not count change, the simplest calculations defeated her. She could never learn to read or write, and she would average 60 or less in IQ tests. Intellectually, then, Rebecca felt a cripple. Spiritually she felt herself a full and complete being. When I first saw her, I saw her neurological impairments, a multitude of apraxias and agnosias, a mass of sensoromotor impairments and breakdowns, limitations of intellectual schemata and concepts similar, by Piaget's criteria, to those of a child of 8. The next time I saw her, I saw Rebecca sitting on a bench, gazing at the April foliage quietly, with obvious delight. Sitting there, in a light dress, her face calm and slightly smiling. She could have been any young woman enjoying a beautiful spring day. This was my human, as opposed to my neurological, vision. She had done appallingly in the testing which, in a sense, was designed, like all neurological and psychological testing, not merely to uncover, to bring out deficits, but to decompose her into functions and deficits. She had come apart, horribly, in formal testing, but now she was mysteriously together and composed. But the tests had given no inkling of anything but the deficits, of anything, so to speak, beyond her deficits. They had given me no hint of her positive powers, her ability to perceive the real world, the world of nature, and perhaps of the imagination as a coherent, intelligible, poetic whole, her ability to see this, think this, and lie this. I found myself thinking, can she use a narrative, or dramatic, mode to compose and integrate a coherent world? And as I thought, I remembered her dancing, and how this could organize her otherwise ill-knit and clumsy movements. Then, in November, her grandmother died, and the light, the joy, she had expressed in April now turned into the deepest grief and darkness. She was devastated, but conducted herself with great dignity. I called on her as soon as I heard the news. Her speech was again ejaculated, Jacksonian, in brief utterances of grief and lamentation. Why did she have to go, she cried, and added, I'm crying for me, not for her. I'm so cold, she cried, huddling into herself. It's not outside, it's winter inside. Cold as death, she added. She was a part of me. Part of me died with her. She was complete in her mourning, tragic and complete. There was absolutely no sense of her being then a mental defective. After half an hour, she said, it is winter. I feel dead. But I know the spring will come again. During the intervening months, between my first seeing her, in April, and her grandmother's death that November, Rebecca was pressed into a variety of workshops and classes, as part of our developmental and cognitive drive. It didn't work with most of them. It was not the right thing to do, because what we did was to drive them full tilt upon their limitations, as had already been done, futilely, and often to the point of cruelty, throughout their lives. We paid far too much attention to the defects of our patients, and far too little to what was intact or preserved. Rebecca made clear the two forms of thought and mind, paradigmatic and narrative, in Bruner's terminology. And though equally natural and native to the expanding human mind, the narrative comes first, has spiritual priority. Very young children love and demand stories. It is this narrative or symbolic power which gives a sense of the world, a concrete reality in the imaginative form of symbol and story, when abstract thought can provide nothing at all. A child follows the Bible before he follows Euclid. Not because the Bible is simpler, but because it is cast in a symbolic and narrative mode. And in this way Rebecca, at 19, was still, just like a child. Like a child, but not a child, because she was adult. With Rebecca allowed, or encouraged in, a personal development, the emotional and narrative and symbolic powers can develop strongly and exuberantly, and may produce, as in Rebecca, a sort of natural poet, and Rebecca realized this fully. After her grandmother's death, she became clear and decisive. I want no more classes, no more workshops, she said. They do nothing for me. They do nothing to bring me together. She looked down at the office carpet and said, I'm like a sort of living carpet. I need a pattern, a design, like you have on that carpet. I come apart, I unravel, unless there's a design. I thought, can one have a raw carpet without a design? Could one have the design without the carpet? A living carpet, as Rebecca was, had to have both, and she especially, with her lack of schematic structure, the warp and woof, the knit, of the carpet, so to speak, might indeed unravel without a design, the scenic or narrative structure of the carpet. I must have meaning, she went on. What I really love, is the theater. We removed Rebecca from the workshop she hated, and managed to enroll her in a special theater group. She loved this, it composed her, she did amazingly well, she became a complete person. And now if one sees Rebecca on stage, for theater, and the theater group soon became her life, one would never even guess that she was mentally defective. Postscript. The power of music, narrative, and drama is of the greatest practical and theoretical importance. Even people with IQs below 20 and the extremest motor incompetence and bewilderment. Their uncouth movements may disappear in a moment with music and dancing. The same may be seen, in patients with severe frontal lobe damage and apraxia, an inability to do things, to retain the simplest motor sequences and programs, even to walk, despite perfectly preserved intelligence in all other ways. What we see, is the power of music to organize, and to do this efficaciously, as well as joyfully, when abstract or schematic forms of organization fail. Thus music, or any other form of narrative, is essential when working with the retarded or apraxic. Schooling or therapy for them must be centered on music or something equivalent. And in drama there is still more. There is the power of role to give organization, to confer, while it lasts, an entire personality. The capacity to perform, to play, to be, seems to be a given in human life, in a way which has nothing to do with intellectual differences. 22. A walking grove. Martin A., aged 61, Parkinsonian and unable to look after himself any longer. He had meningitis in infancy, which caused retardation, impulsiveness, seizures, and some spasticity on one side. He had very limited schooling, but a remarkable musical education. It would have been a dull and disheartening life, had it not been for his remarkable musical gifts and sensibilities, and the joy this brought him and others. I know more than 2,000 operas, he told me, although he had never learned or been able to read music. Unfortunately, his voice was not up to his ear, being tuneful, but gruff, with some spastic dysphonia. He enjoyed a modest fame as a walking encyclopedia, who knew not only the music of 2,000 operas, but all the singers who had taken the roles in countless performances, and all the details of scenery, staging, dress, and decor. But the real joy and the only thing that made life supportable was actual participation in musical events, singing in the choirs at local churches. As he soared up into the music, Martin forgot that he was retarded, forgot all the sadness and badness of his life, sensed a great spaciousness enfold him, felt himself both a true man and a true child of God. If a page of an encyclopedia or newspaper was read to him, or a map of Asia's rivers or New York's subways shown to him, it was recorded, instantly, in his eidetic memory. But he had no relation to these eidetic recordings. What of his world generally? It was, in many respects, small, petty, nasty, and dark, the world of someone who had rarely felt himself, or felt regarded as, a proper child or man. In January, I went to see Martin and found a very different man, no longer cocky, showing off, as before, but obviously pining, in spiritual and a sort of physical pain. "I've got to sing," he said hoarsely. "I can't live without it. And it's not just music, I can't pray without it." And then he said, music, to Bach, was the apparatus of worship. Grove article on Bach, page 304. "I've never spent a Sunday, without going to church, without singing in the choir. I've got to go," he said fiercely. "It'll kill me if I don't." The church was not far from the home, and Martin was welcomed back. With this, life suddenly and dramatically changed. Martin had resumed his proper place, as he felt it. He could sing, he could worship, in Bach's music every Sunday, and also enjoy the quiet authority that was accorded him. What was central to Martin, as it had been central for his father, was always the spirit of music, especially religious music, and of the voice as the divine instrument made and ordained to sing, to raise itself in jubilation and praise. Martin became a different man, then, when he returned to song and church, recovered himself, recollected himself, became real again. The pseudo-persons, the stigmatized retardate, the snotty, spitting boy disappeared, as did the irritating, emotionless, impersonal eidetic. But the real marvel, was to see Martin when he was actually singing, or in communion with music, listening with an intentness which verged on rapture, a man in his wholeness wholly attending. Martin was, in a word, transformed. All that was defective or pathological fell away, and one saw only absorption and animation, wholeness and health. Postscript. A case study by David Viscott, 1970. There are many similarities between Martin and his patient Harriet G. In both cases there were extraordinary powers. She could compose, and improvise, in the style of any composer. It is clear that both could be pushed, or drawn, into the sort of mechanical feats considered typical of idiot savants, feats at once prodigious and meaningless, but also, when not pushed or drawn in this fashion, showed a consistent seeking after beauty and order. Book, Sensitivity to Tonal Structure in a Developmentally Disabled Musical Savant. Study of this 5-year-old prodigy, with severe mental and other handicaps due to maternal rubella, showed not rote memory of a mechanical sort, but impressive sensitivity to the rules governing composition, particularly the role of different notes in determining diatonic key structure. Implying implicit knowledge of structural rules in a generative sense, that is, rules not limited to the specific examples provided by one's experience. This, I am convinced, is the case with Martin, too, and one must wonder whether it may not be true of all idiot savants, that they may be truly and creatively intelligent, and not just have a mechanical knack. It is the intelligence, albeit in a special and narrow area, that finally forces itself on one, and it is this intelligence that must be recognized and nurtured. 23. The twins. John and Michael, 26 years old. Diagnosed as autistic, psychotic, or severely retarded. There was nothing much to them except for their remarkable documentary memories of the tiniest visual details of their own experience, and their use of an unconscious, calendrical algorithm that enabled them to say at once on what day of the week a date far in the past or future would fall. But one must lay aside the urge to limit and test, and get to know the twins, observe them, openly, quietly, without presuppositions, but with a full and sympathetic phenomenological openness, as they live and think and interact quietly, pursuing their own lives, spontaneously, in their singular way. Then one finds there is something exceedingly mysterious at work, powers and depths of a perhaps fundamental sort. They are indistinguishable, mirror images, identical in face, in body movements, in personality, in mind, identical too in their stigmata of brain and tissue damage. A variety of peculiar tics and mannerisms, and a very high, degenerative myopia, requiring glasses so thick that their eyes seem distorted. They tend to be featured in the annual show in the hospital I work in, a rather embarrassing, appearances on TV. The twins say, "Give us a date any time in the last or next 40,000 years," and they tell you what day of the week it would be. They will also tell you the date of Easter during the same period of 80,000 years. One may observe, that their eyes move and fix in a peculiar way as they do this, as if they were unrolling, or scrutinizing, an inner landscape, a mental calendar. They have the look of seeing, of intense visualization, although it has been concluded that what is involved is pure calculation. Their memory for digits is remarkable and possibly unlimited. They will repeat a number of 3 digits, of 30 digits, of 300 digits, with equal ease. This too has been attributed to a method. But when one comes to test their ability to calculate the mental calculators, they do astonishingly badly, as badly as their IQs of 60. They cannot do simple addition or subtraction with any accuracy, and cannot even comprehend what multiplication or division means. And it has been inferred and accepted, that what is involved is not memory at all, but the use of an unconscious algorithm for calendar calculations. By it is scarcely credible that these twins, incapable of even the simplest arithmetical methods, could have inferred, worked out, and be using such an algorithm. Stephen Smith comments. Here, clearly, one is dealing with memories that seem of a documentary kind, in which there is no personal reference, no personal relation, no living center whatever. But it could be said, that memories of this kind never had any personal character, for this indeed is a cardinal characteristic of eidetic memory such as this. And if you ask them how they can hold so much in their minds, a 300-figure digit, or the trillion events of 4 decades, they say, we see it. And seeing visualizing of extraordinary intensity, limitless range, and perfect fidelity, seems to be the key to this. My own first sight of the natural powers, and natural mode, of the twins came in a spontaneous, and rather comic, manner. A box of matches on their table fell, and discharged its contents on the floor. 111, they both cried simultaneously, and then, in a murmur, John said 37. Michael repeated this, John said it a third time and stopped. I counted the matches, it took me some time, and there were 111. How could you count the matches so quickly? I asked. We didn't count, they said. We saw the 111. And why did you murmur 37, and repeat it 3 times? I asked the twins. They said in unison, 37, 37, 37, 111. And this, if possible, I found even more puzzling. That they should see 111 111ness a sort of absolute pitch, for numbers. Similar case, Zacharias Das, the number prodigy, who would instantly call out 183 or 79 if a pile of peas was poured out, and indicate as best he could he was also a dullard, that he did not count the peas, but just saw their number, as a whole, in a flash. I had already come to feel, through their seeing events and dates, did hold, an immense mnemonic tapestry, a vast, or possibly infinite, landscape in which everything could be seen, either isolated or in relation. It was isolation, rather than a sense of relation, that was chiefly exhibited when they unfurled their implacable, haphazard documentary. If they could see 111ness at a glance, if they could see an entire constellation of numbers, might they not also see, at a glance see, recognize, relate, and compare, in an entirely sensual and non-intellectual way, enormously complex formations and constellations of numbers? A ridiculous, even disabling power. A second time they were seated in a corner together, they seemed to be locked in a singular, purely numerical, converse. John would say a number, a 6-figure number. Michael would catch the number, nod, smile, and seem to savor it. Then he, in turn, would say another 6-figure number, and now it was John who received, and appreciated it richly. As I drove home, I thought of Luria's twins, Lyasha and Yura, brain damaged, speech damaged identical twins, and how they would play and prattle with each other, in a primitive, babble-like language of their own. John and Michael were not even using words or half-words, simply throwing numbers at each other. Were these Borgeshian or Funchian numbers, mere numeric vines, or pony manes, or constellations, private number forms, a sort of number argot known to the twins alone? As soon as I got home, I pulled out tables of powers, factors, logarithms, and primes. The 6-figure numbers, which the twins had exchanged, were primes, i.e., numbers that could be evenly divided by no other whole number than itself or 1. Had they somehow seen or possessed such a book as mine, or were they, in some unimaginable way, themselves seeing primes, in some with the same way as they had seen 111ness, or triple 37ness? Certainly, they could not be calculating them, they could calculate nothing. I returned to the ward the next day, I ventured an 8-figure prime. They both turned towards me, then suddenly became still. They had, after some unimaginable internal process of testing, suddenly seen my own 8-digit number as a prime. They drew apart slightly, making room for me, a new number playmate, a third in their world. Then John brought out a 9-figure number, and after Michael responded with a similar one. And then I added a 10-figure prime I found in my book. And then John, after a prodigious internal contemplation, brought out a 12-figure number. I had no way of checking this, because my own book did not go beyond 10-figure primes. But Michael was up to it, though it took him 5 minutes, and an hour later the twins were swapping 20-figure primes. But there is no simple method for primes of this order, and yet the twins were doing it. I thought of Das, who was singularly devoid of mathematical grasp. Yet he in 12 years made tables of factors and prime numbers for the 7th and nearly the whole of the 8th million. But was not clear, is whether Das had any method for the tables he made up, or whether, as hinted in his simple number-seeing experiments, he somehow saw these great primes, as apparently the twins did. I observed them in countless other sorts of number games or number communion. They are dealing with real properties or qualities, for the arbitrary, such as random numbers, gives them no pleasure. It is clear that they must have sense in their numbers. A pair of examples: the musician who turns numbers into music, and the counter who turns music into numbers. One could scarcely have, one feels, more opposite sorts of mind, or, at least, more opposite modes of mind. I believe the twins, who have an extraordinary feeling for numbers, without being able to calculate at all, are allied not to Buxton but to talk in this matter, except that they do not convert numbers into music, but actually feel them, in themselves, as forms, as tones. Dmitri Mendeleev, for example, carried around with him, written on cards, the numerical properties of elements, until they became utterly familiar to him, so familiar that he no longer thought of them as aggregates of properties, but, so he tells us, as familiar faces. He now saw the elements, iconically, physiognomically, as faces related, like members of a family. The philosopher seeks to hear within himself the echoes of the world's symphony, writes Nietzsche, and to reproject them in the form of concepts. The twins, though morons, hear the world's symphony, I conjecture, but hear it entirely in the form of numbers. Mathematics has always been called the queen of sciences, and mathematicians have always felt number as the great mystery, and the world as organized, mysteriously, by the power of number. And yet numbers for them, I believe, are not just numbers, but significances, signifiers whose significant is the world. The twins seem to employ a direct cognition. They see, directly, a universe and heaven of numbers. But what right have we to call it pathological? Provides a singular self-sufficiency and serenity to their lives, and one which it might be tragic to interfere with, or break. This serenity was, in fact, interrupted and broken, when it was felt that the twins should be separated for their own good, to prevent their unhealthy communication together, and in order that they could come out and face the world they were separated. In 1977, both have been moved now into halfway houses, and do menial jobs, for pocket money. They are able to take buses, and to keep themselves moderately presentable and clean, though their moronic and psychotic character is still recognizable at a glance. But there is a negative side too. Deprived of their numerical communion with each other, and of time and opportunity for any contemplation or communion at all, they are always being hurried and jostled from one job to another. They seem to have lost their strange numerical power, and with this the chief joy and sense of their lives. But this is considered a small price to pay, no doubt, for their having become quasi-independent and socially acceptable. One is reminded of the treatment of Nadia, an autistic child with a phenomenal gift for drawing. Nadia too was subjected to a therapeutic regime to find ways in which her potentialities in other directions could be maximized. The net effect was that she started talking and stopped drawing. Nigel Dennis comments, "We are left with a genius who has had her genius removed, leaving nothing behind but a general defectiveness." What are we supposed to think about such a curious cure? In the case of the twins, of course, it was not just a faculty, but the personal and emotional center of their lives. And now they are separated, now it is gone, there is no longer any sense or center to their lives. Postscript. Their ability to determine the days of the week within an 80,000-year period suggests a rather simple algorithm. One divides the total number of days between now and then by 7. If there is no remainder, then that date falls on the same day as now. If the remainder is 1, then that date is 1 day later, and so on. Notice that modular arithmetic is cyclic, it consists of repetitive patterns. Perhaps the twins were visualizing these patterns, either in the form of easily constructed charts, or some kind of landscape. This leaves unanswered why the twins communicate in primes. But calendar arithmetic requires the prime of 7. And if one is thinking of modular arithmetic in general, modular division will produce neat cyclic patterns only if one uses prime numbers. When they say about the matchsticks 1 11 37 3 times, note they are taking the prime 37, and multiplying by 3. In fact, only the prime patterns could be visualized. The different patterns produced by the different prime numbers, for example, multiplication tables, may be the pieces of visual information that they are communicating to each other when they repeat a given prime number. In short, modular arithmetic may help them to retrieve their past, and consequently the patterns created in using these calculations, which only occur with primes, may take on a particular significance for the twins. One has to wonder whether there may not be a conventional arithmetic, that is, an arithmetic of operations, often irritating to teacher and student, unnatural, and hard to learn, and also a deep arithmetic of the kind described by Gauss, which may be truly innate to the brain, as innate as Chomsky's deep syntax and generative grammars. Such an arithmetic, in minds like the twins, could be dynamic and almost alive. The park's child Ella was a talented drawer and was also highly gifted with numbers. She was fascinated by the order of numbers, especially primes. Another autistic child, who covered sheets of paper with numbers written down compulsively. All were primes. Another young autistic man who was also fascinated by factors and primes, and how he instantly perceived these as special. Anything special, Joe, about that number, 4875. Joe, it's just divisible by 13 and 25. Of another, 7241, it's divisible by 13 and 557. And of 8741, it's a prime number. It is not clear how the answers are arrived at almost instantaneously, whether they are worked out, known, remembered, or somehow just seen. What is clear is the peculiar sense of pleasure and significance attaching to primes. Kurt Gödel has discussed how numbers, especially primes, can serve as markers for ideas, people, places, whatever, and such a Gödelian marking would pave the way for an arithmetization or numeralization of the world. If this does occur, the twins do not merely live in a world of numbers, but in the world, as numbers, their number meditation or play being a sort of existential meditation and, if one can understand it, or find the key to a strange and precise communication to. In prosopagnosia, in which, as a consequence of a lesion in the right occipital cortex, patients become unable to recognize faces as such, and have to employ an elaborate, absurd, and indirect route, involving a bit-by-bit analysis of meaningless and separate features. 24. The Autist Artist. Draw this, I said, and gave Jose my pocket watch. He was about 21, Jose drew with an absolute stillness, concentrating completely on the little clock before him. Jose had drawn the watch with remarkable fidelity, putting in every feature, at least every essential feature, the time, though this was faithfully registered as 11:31, but every second as well, and the inset seconds dial, but Jose had no idea of time. And otherwise, there was an odd mixture of close accuracy, with curious elaborations and variations. Then, Jose came casually into the clinic. There was a sudden, shy smile, like a glimpse through a door. I want to see more drawing, and I gave him my pen. I had a copy of Arizona Highways with me. The cover depicted an idyllic scene of people canoeing on a lake, against a backdrop of mountains and sunset. I said, go onto the canoe. Rapidly, Jose outlined the silhouetted figures and the canoe. He looked at them, then looked away, their forms fixed in his mind, and swiftly blocked them in with the side of the pen. I was amazed at the swiftness and the minute accuracy of reproduction, for the image had a dramatic quality not present in the original. The tiny figures, enlarged, were more intense, more alive, had a feeling of involvement and purpose not at all clear in the original. The so-called iconicity, subjectivity, intentionality, dramatization were present. He seemed to have clear powers of imagination and creativity. It was not a canoe but his canoe that emerged in the drawing. Draw this, I said, pointing to a fish. He gazed at it intently, seemed to smile to himself, and then turned away, and he drew a fish of his own. Jose's fish, tilted and poised, was richly three-dimensional, far more like a real fish than the original. The canoe had shown that Jose had an impressive visual memory, and more. The fish showed a lively and distinctive imagination, a sense of humor, and something akin to fairy tale art, certainly not great art. It was primitive, perhaps it was child art, but, without doubt, it was art of a sort. I had a lengthy chart available to me, containing early descriptions of his original illness, a very high fever at the age of 8, associated with the onset of incessant, and subsequently continuing, seizures, and the rapid appearance of a brain-damaged or autistic condition. His spinal fluid had been abnormal during the acute stage of the illness. The consensus was that he had probably suffered an encephalitis of sorts. His seizures were of many different types: petit mal, grand mal, akinetic, and psychomotor, these last being seizures of an exceptionally complex type. Psychomotor seizures can also be associated with sudden passion and violence, and the occurrence of peculiar behavior states even between seizures, the so-called psychomotor personality. They are invariably associated with disorder in, or damage to, the temporal lobes, and severe temporal lobe disorder, both left-sided and right-sided, had been demonstrated in Jose by innumerable EEGs. The temporal lobes are also associated with the auditory capacities, and, in particular, the perception and production of speech. Dr. Rapin had not only considered Jose autistic, but had wondered whether a temporal lobe disorder had caused a verbal auditory agnosia and inability to recognize speech sounds that interfered with his capacity to use or understand the spoken word. For what was striking, why he became mute, and ceased talking to others when he became ill. One capacity was apparently spared, perhaps in a compensatory way enhanced, an unusual passion and power to draw, which had been evident since early childhood. With the onset of his illness, with his seemingly intractable seizures, he might have 20 or 30 major convulsions a day, and uncounted little seizures, falls, blanks, or dreamy states. With the loss of speech and his general intellectual and emotional regression, Jose found himself in a strange and tragic state. At the age of 9, he dropped out of school, out of society, out of almost all of what for a normal child would be reality. For 15 years he scarcely emerged from the house, ostensibly because of intractable seizures, his mother maintaining she dared not take him out, otherwise he would have 20 or 30 seizures in the street every day. All sorts of anticonvulsants were tried, but his epilepsy seemed untreatable. Jose, in effect, disappeared from the world, was lost to follow up, confined and convulsing in his cellar room. He showed a passion for pictorial magazines, especially of natural history, and when he was able, between seizures and scoldings, would find stumps of pencil and draw what he saw. This, and this only, he was permitted to retain, his one remaining link with reality. Coming to the hospital and having his seizures controlled by powerful new drugs, for the first time, gave him some space and freedom, a release, both physiological and psychological, of a sort he had not known since the age of 8. Hospitals are places that provide a refuge for the tormented, storm-tossed soul, provided with just that mixture of order and freedom of which it stands in such need. He had now been in hospital for 4 weeks, he started to have hope, to become more animated, to turn to others as he had never done before, not, at least, since the onset of autism. But now there was temptation, and pressure, to interact, pressure that was often too much. And precisely at such time Jose would relapse, to the isolation, to the primitive rocking movements, he had at first shown. The third time, he was sitting, rocking, in the frightful day room, his face and eyes closed, a picture of regression. As soon as I called him, he jumped up, and eagerly, hungrily, followed me to the art room. I said, "That fish, can you remember it, can you draw it again?" He closed his eyes for a moment, summoning an image. And then drew. It was still a trout, rainbow-spotted, with fringy fins and a forked tail, but, this time, with egregiously human features, an odd nostril, what fish has nostrils, and a pair of ripely human lips? The fish before had existed as an icon in isolation, now it was to become part of a world, a scene. Rapidly he sketched in a little fish, a companion, obviously in play. I couldn't avoid the feeling, that this drawing was symbolic, the little fish and the big fish, perhaps him and me? Then, I found a Christmas card, a robin redbreast on a tree trunk, snow and stark twigs all around. I gestured to the bird, and gave Jose the pen. The bird was finely drawn. But the dry winter twiglet, next to the tree trunk, had shot up in his drawing, expanded into florid open bloom. That Jose had changed winter into spring. Now, finally, he started to speak, though speak is much too strong a term for the strange sounding, stumbling, that came out. We had reduced, though not annulled, his temporal lobe disorders. His EEGs still showed in these lobes a sort of low-grade electrical muttering, occasional spikes, dysrhythmia, slow waves. If he could remove their convulsiveness, he could not reverse the damage they had sustained. We had improved his physiological potentials for speech, though there was an impairment of his abilities to use, understand, and recognize speech. But he now was fighting for the recovery of his understanding and speech, and indeed had turned against virtually all communication with others, verbal and otherwise. Speech impairment and the refusal to speak had coupled before in the double malignancy of disease. Even to Jose would never speak with any facility approaching normal, that speech could never, for him, be a real vehicle for self-expression, could serve only to express his simpler needs. And he himself seemed to feel this too, and, while he continued to fight for speech, turned more fiercely to drawing for self-expression. One final episode. When I went up to this new ward, he waved his hand lustily as soon as he saw me, an outgoing, open gesture. He pointed to the locked door, he wanted it open, he wanted to go outside. He led the way downstairs, into the overgrown, sunlit garden. Nor did I have to offer him a pen, he took one himself. He was delighted most of all by the great yellow dandelions, open, all their florets flung open to the sun. The need to draw was immediate and strong. He placed his clipboard on the ground, and, holding the dandelion, drew it. It is a splendid drawing, accurate and alive. It shows his love for reality, for another form of life. His mind is not built for the abstract, the conceptual. That is not available to him as a path to truth. But he has a passion and a real power for the particular. He loves it, he enters into it, he recreates it. And the particular, if one is particular enough, is also a nature's road to reality and truth. The abstract, the categorical, has no interest for the autistic person. The concrete, the particular, the singular, is all. Thus, they live, not in a universe, but in a multiverse, of innumerable, exact, and passionately intense particulars. There may be a deep satisfaction in particulars, especially if they shine, as they may do for Jose, with an emblematic radiance. I think Jose, an autist, a simpleton too, has such a gift for the concrete, for form, that he is, in his way, a naturalist and natural artist. He grasps the world as forms and reproduces them. He has fine literal powers, but he has figurative powers too. The autistic, by their nature, are seldom open to influence. It is their fate to be isolated, and thus original. Their vision, if it can be glimpsed, comes from within and appears aboriginal. Autism was once seen as a childhood schizophrenia, but the schizophrenic's complaint is always of influence from the outside. He is passive, he is played upon, he cannot be himself. The autistic would complain if they complained of absence of influence, of absolute isolation. In classical autism, which is manifest, and often total, by the third year of life, the cutting off is so early there may be no memory of the main. In secondary autism, like Jose's, caused by brain disease at a later stage in life, there is some memory, perhaps some nostalgia, for the main. This may explain why Jose was more accessible in drawing. What does the future hold for Jose? Is there some place for him in the world which will employ his autonomy, but leave it intact? He has done beautiful altar pieces, in mosaic and stained wood, for churches. He has carved exquisite lettering on tombstones. His current job is hand-printing sundry notices for the ward. He could do all of these but, alas, he will do none, unless someone very understanding can guide and employ him. For, as the stars stand, he will probably do nothing, and spend a useless, fruitless life, as so many other autistic people do, overlooked, unconsidered, in the back ward of a state hospital. Postscript. Artistic gifts of fairly high order are not uncommon among the autistic. But there must occur, a spontaneous production of striking drawings. Shat seem to be the cardinal characteristics of such drawings. These include negative characteristics, such as derivativeness and stereotypy, and positive ones, such as an unusual capacity for delayed rendition, and for rendering the object as perceived, not as conceived, hence the sort of inspired naivete especially seen. Morris Hima and Mojigai, who have had remarkable success in bringing autists from an untutored, and seemingly unteachable, childhood giftedness to professionally accomplished adult artistry. Morris Hima favors special instructional techniques, highly structured skill training, a sort of apprenticeship, and encouragement of drawing as a means of communication. But such formal training is not enough. A most intimate, empathic relationship is required. Dr. Park conclude the world of the simple. The secret may lie elsewhere, in the dedication that led Mojigai to live with another retarded artist in his home, and to write. The secret in developing Yanamura's talent was to share his spirit. The teacher should love the beautiful, honest retarded person, and live with a purified, retarded world.